Hello, and thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to today's Alumni Education Webinar Negotiation, which will be presented by Professor Marc Modica. This webinar is brought to you by the Center for Global Initiatives and the Office of Engagement. I'm Shale Colbreth, Director of Engagement Operations and Programs here at Darden, and this webinar represents our continuing efforts to provide educational content to our alumni worldwide. We will begin momentarily, but I need to go over a few logistical details. You will notice on your screen the chat feature. You can use this tool to type in questions during the webinar. Please feel free to send a question at any time during the webinar. You don't need to wait until a question and answer period. In the meantime, please make sure that all of your microphones are set to mute. Now, please let me introduce our presenter, Marc Modica. Marc teaches negotiation and communication courses at Darden. He previously taught at a variety of other institutions all over the world, including the University of Japan, University of Hawaii, and the University of Washington, to name a few. With that, please let me turn it over to Marc.
Okay, great. I just want to first check to make sure that everyone can hear me. If I can just have a spattering of people on the chat room saying, yep, I can hear you, then I'll have the confidence to proceed. Gengi Zutsu, hey, how are you doing? Zubin mate, I see some friends here. Cool. Hey, listen, I also want to make sure that your microphones are up. I usually don't see, I usually see microphones over on my screen. I don't see any right now. We won't see any? Okay. They'll just chat in, but we can raise hands as well, right? Okay, so I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about what I'm going to focus on today and then open up the floor to you. You know, I've been teaching negotiations as part of my regular coursework since, the late 80s, early 90s, and it's something that I never get tired of. I may have had some of you in my classes here at Darden, but I love teaching the subject. I do a lot of executive education. I do a lot of pro bono work with organizations. I do some consulting. I like to talk about negotiations every opportunity I get, and that's because I absolutely find the topic fascinating. Not everyone I know finds negotiations so enjoyable. As a matter of fact, a lot of people have a lot of trepidation about negotiation and being involved in that process. And just to acknowledge that and get started, I'm going to ask you to do what I do at many of my sessions to get launched. And I would like to ask people here. Some people really love to negotiate, and some people are less than enthusiastic about that, the opportunity. Those people who have some sort of hesitancy, I'd like to get a sampling from you online. Participating, speaking to the rest of the group, what are some of the things that makes negotiation less than the most fun activity to be involved in when you get up in the morning? If I can have some hands around that or some participation. Jared, how do I select here without the hands? I'd rather have you pipe in with a microphone than just on the chat room. Can you join me in the... Yeah, disapproval from others. Murray, do you have a microphone? Nope. Carrie, who does have a microphone? Oh, there's some microphones. Hands up, people that would like to participate. Carrie, come on in. Can't quite hear you.
How about that? Is that working?
Now I hear you. Thanks. Good. Go ahead,
Okay,
Carrie.
great. Hi. Yeah, so I think sometimes in tough negotiations, things turn in personal, right? Sort of keeping the conversation focused on the issue and rather than the people, I think, is sometimes a source of discomfort for me.
And why do you think that happens?
Ooh, I don't know. I don't know, maybe because people see their ability to negotiate as a reflection of their own personal worth, or what they're getting out of the negotiation is being reflective of, whether they're a worthy person or not, or a worthy whatever role they're playing.
Gotcha. So it's the notion that there's something on the table at stake, and part of that might just be something around identity as well. Yeah, Zubin, nice to see you here.
Hey, great to see you, Mark. Can you hear
Yeah,
me?
beautifully. Your mellifluous voice carries well.
Well, another thing that I think about when I think about negotiations is, in many cases, you have to work with the same people after, on an ongoing basis. And um, when people see it as if some parties to the negotiation see it as a zero-sum game,
Hmm.
that for you to get anything that you need, they're losing.
Hmm.
um, then the question is, whether it's for a bonus or whether it's for a new challenge on your responsibility, they may cave for this one, but they may come back to get to claim their pound of flesh at a later date or just drag it on. And I guess if you don't know the person well enough, or sometimes even if you do, you're not quite sure how they're going to take.
Gotcha. So in an ongoing working situation, it can sort of has the possibility or the potential to degrade rather than enhance relationships is part of what you're saying, not the totality of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
gotcha. Um, let's see. Gang, you said something about confrontation. What was that? Do you have a mic there in front of you? Feels confrontational. Do you want to speak to that? Okay, okay. Other feelings about this topic.
I can't hear this.
Just wanting approval from others.
Who's that?
Murray?
Oh, gotcha. So go ahead. Elaborate.
Just wanting to be liked and be approved and accepted by others is extremely important. And when you think that others don't like you or are disapproving of what you're doing and saying, then your overall sense of well-being could actually decline.
Gotcha. Okay. I'm going to press it a little bit more to make this as interactive as I can, so have patience with my silence. I'm waiting for some more people because I've heard these things before, and I've heard a lot more, in fact.
If I may, Mark, another one, Zubin here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Um, in some cases, with again more on the internal within a company, it's one of the things that I realize is you don't, with secrecy of what other people are getting paid, you don't know if you don't know what to benchmark yourself against necessarily, and also the way some companies work, it's you have people who don't get their market value with the company that they work with, even though people like them. So they leave, and then 6 months later they're hired back at what they were asking for, or what they thought they deserved, plus more,
Yeah.
right? So it just becomes a question of how do we do this?
Yeah, and that experience makes it sort of feel like a game as well, right? This sort of playing chicken, and I'm going to do the walk away, and I'm going to come back, and we're going to see what it's all about. Yeah, I think one of the things that is disconcerting about negotiation is, you come in, you think you're well prepared, and of course it takes a ton of time to be prepared for a negotiation, which is one of the things that people don't like, the time investment that the proper approach to negotiation requires. People come in, they work, they've prepared, they spend a lot of time, they go back and forth, they start at one point with an ask, they have to make concessions, and then at the end of all that, you don't know whether you've done well or not. You have no idea as to whether, it's something that is, acceptable or whether you could have gotten more. You really don't have any idea. So it can be quite confrontational, and as Gen says, it sort of feels like a zero-sum game, and you don't know how much of the pie you actually got. People say to me that, it's confrontational, it feels as if they are compromising relationships. lots of these things. Is somebody trying to participate here? I hear a little background. Somebody want to get in? If you want to interrupt me at any time from talking, that's great. The other thing is that people say, well, you know, I'm sitting across the table from someone, and I know that unlike a regular sort of conversation, these people have an incentive to misrepresent or inflate or bluff or be less than completely 100% open and transparent about what they're saying. And it makes me uncomfortable that I'm engaged in a relationship with somebody, in a process with somebody, where they have all of these temptations to misconstrue. Makes me feel uncomfortable. And I think worse than that even is that when we are in those situations, we have to confront the reality that we have incentives to misconstrue or to exaggerate or to bluff. So it's sort of an uncomfortable relationship to be in. And so the majority of people, if you ask about negotiations, they say, well, I realize that it's sort of a necessity and that I need to develop some skills in this area, but it's not something that I really want to engage in. And that's understandable because most of the time, if we can look at this slide here, most of the time we're in negotiations that people see as just being sort of, as Geng says, a zero-sum game. We're talking about the price of a product, or we're talking about a delivery date once we've made the purchase, or we're talking about something that is just simply, you know, one person wants to go higher on the line and one person wants to go lower on the line. And if we look at that, I'm sure most of you, maybe many of you, have gone through a negotiations course with me or with Melissa Thomas Hunt or with Sherwood Fry, or if you go back far enough with Dana Kleiman, to remember some of those sort of basics that, you know, if you're in a one-item negotiation, particularly if it's one issue, which is represented by the big, bold, horizontal line, and it's one time with two people with no sort of sense of future relationship or past history, you see you're negotiating over just one thing, and there's a point for, let's say, in a negotiation that involves a buyer, a point that's represented by that vertical line, which is sort of the walk away for the buyer. You know, at what point will I say no? At what point will they go too far? At what point will the price become too much? Where I have alternatives to negotiating agreement with this person that are better. And that's represented by that old botna that I hope most of you are familiar with, that best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And likewise, as we all know, there's the walk away for the seller as well, which is, you know, if I go below this point, I have better alternatives to coming to an agreement. And then in between there's that zone of potential agreement. And if we look at negotiations this way, then it's quite an unpleasant affair, or it can be. It can be just sort of, it can feel like a tug of war, you know, and that's it. Who can tug the longest and the hardest? Who can hold back the longest and be more intransigent than the other person? Who can persuade the other person that maybe their alternatives are not as good as they think they are? Who, you know, it's a matter of persuasion and power, and that doesn't feel good. So why am I enthusiastic about the notion of negotiation? Well, because I truly believe that negotiation gives us the opportunity to do two really amazing things that lead to valuable interactions rather than deleterious or sort of eroding processes to our relationship and our feelings about others. And the first of those is to simply feel comfortable asking for the things that we feel are important, asking for the things that we want either for ourselves or for our constituents, right? Asking for the things that will make our work easier, make our work more effective, make our employees more able to access resources that will make their work either more creative or fulfilling or whatever. That ability to ask. And some people are intimidated by the very notion of asking for something. It's amazing how, if you're once in the habit of feeling comfortable with that process of asking in a polite and sort of engaging way, what would you say if you could do a little bit better on this? Or what would you say if we could arrange for me and my people to have a little bit more than that? Or would you be open to, considering, a little bit more of time or a little bit more resource? Once you feel comfortable with that and ask folks, it's amazing how often people will say yes. I know that I personally am in the habit of just sort of politely asking when somebody's done making me an offer if it can't be a little bit better. And it is amazing how oftentimes people will say, sure, yeah, we can do a little something there. Or, no, we can't really do that, but maybe we could do a little something over here that would make you feel better. How would you feel about that? I was teaching a session, had a program I was working on with Lou Ann Lynch and Elliot Weiss last summer down in beautiful city, Puebla, Mexico. And at the end of the program, most of us were flying out to other places in the world, mostly the U.S. I was at the airport very early in the morning, and there was a woman sitting next to me who was part of the program. And she said, Mark, I really appreciate your encouraging all of us to ask and to have the courage to just say, make a proposal for a little bit more or a little something different. She said, but that is something that would make me very uncomfortable. I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if I can really feel good about that. I was a little surprised, and I looked at her, and you could see her lip trembling, and as a matter of fact, a little tear in her eye. You could see that this was really something that was, some sort of barrier for her to go forward and actuate, well, can you do better, or can you give me this? And I asked her why. Why is that so intimidating? And I was really surprised. She said to me, because I'm afraid that people will say no. I was really taken back by that. She was really intimidated by the possibility that someone would say no. And I said to her, you don't really have to be all that worried about whether they're going to say no or not. And she said, why is that? And I said, because they probably will say no. It's quite frequently the case. Not all the time, but probably more than 50%. At which point you can engage either, one, the reason they have said no, which sometimes can be easily solved, or number two, at what point they might start wanting to say yes, and that engages a conversation around what you call give and take. And in this case, if you're only asking for what you want, I guess it's about take. So I'm more than happy to engage in that process of asking because I'm not afraid of that. I'm not afraid of people saying no, and I'm willing to engage in the reasons behind why they do say no. So that's one of the things I love about negotiation, is it offers the opportunity to engage in a conversation around what others can do for me. Now that sounds a little bit self-centered, and it would be if my interest in negotiation just stopped there. But it doesn't. The second part of negotiation and engaging in the negotiation process that I really, really enjoy, and I really love to engage in, the thing I really love to do, is to not just ask for the things that are of benefit to me, but probably more important and probably more quickly, ask the other person what it is that they want. To ask the other party what it is that I can do for them. As important and as rewarding as it is for me to ask for what I want or what others can do for me, I'm equally and maybe even in a sense a little bit more enthusiastic about asking others what I can do for them. Because once I ask others what I can do for them, that opens up a door where I can dig down and find out what it is I could do for their benefit to help them out that would be of very little cost to me, and maybe even something I would enjoy giving them that they would appreciate, that I would enjoy as well. Not only give them something that would be easy for me to give, but give them something that I would be enthusiastically ready to give. And of course, once that process starts, they, as human beings, will engage in one of the core fundamental driving motivations that all human beings have, which is to reciprocate. There's a guy named, I think I probably have recommended to many of you if I've had you in class or if I'd had the opportunity to be in sessions with you, books by a fellow named Robert Cialdini, Cialdini, Cialdini. If somebody can type that out at the bottom of the page there so everybody can get it, Robert Cialdini in the chat section. He writes on persuasion. And one of the key things that Cialdini says is one of the innate driving forces in human beings, one of the forces that distinguishes us from a lot of other biological entities on this planet is that the sort of drive to reciprocate. And he has plenty of stories. I recommend you go online. There's some very interesting clips on YouTube. One is a short, I think it's a 12-minute session by Cialdini that's with this fellow that draws cartoons to illustrate different sorts of principles and things. It's a wonderful, wonderful little thing to see. But this notion of reciprocation is such a wonderful human instinct that once you engage in this process of what can I do for you, what can you do for me, it sort of builds. That's right, Murray, Robert Cialdini. And if you want to look up the little YouTube clip, I don't want to look at it necessarily here, but it's something to look at later, an animated YouTube clip, something that's really interesting for, I think, all of you to take a look at. It covers 6 basic principles of persuasion that are quite easy to understand and quite easy to implement in ethical and very productive ways. So the notion of negotiation for me is just simply about the process of asking what I can do for others or asking what others can do for me and proceeding from there. I've been talking for a couple minutes. Is there anybody who wants to ask a question or pipe in here? Please raise your hand or come online. Maybe reflections about experiences you've had in this process that have been rewarding or stories from your own lives. I'm happy to open up for a little participation before I move on. And I'll remain silent for a moment to give you some space to do that.
Go ahead. Yeah, go. Question from IGS in Richmond.
Who is this?
This is Ian Hall with IGS in Richmond.
Gotcha, go.
When you're negotiating, not so much with an individual, but with a group of individuals,
yeah.
To what extent does this reciprocation still apply? Because reciprocation tends to be more of a personal response, and when you're dealing with a group of people, can you drive a collective or sort of like a corporate response in the same fashion, or does the argument sort of break down in that context?
I think it's harder to try to capture. One of the problems with reciprocation is the asymmetry of perception. You know, I may do something for you and you may not recognize it as an effort that I've taken on your part, right?
Right.
And that leads to a hell of a lot of frustration. I'm sure most of us have been in situations where we feel that we're always giving and never getting. That's a tricky situation to manage because it's important for all of us to be appreciative of what others have done for us. And yet, when someone expresses appreciation for something we do, it's not uncommon for us to say, "Oh, it was nothing. Think nothing of it. Oh, I would do it for anybody. It's not no, nothing at all." And that diminishes the sense of the other person's appreciation for what you really have done. Now, Cialdini makes the point that if you say, "Yeah, I broke my back and now you owe me one. That doesn't work. As he says, it causes resentment, you know. You don't want to lord over people something that you have done for them with the expectation that they will return a favor for you. And I'm getting to your question. It takes a little while to get back to the group thing. So it's important for us to, without alienating others, appreciate all around what we've done for them, what they've done for us, that there is this interdependence, and sometimes it needs to be made a little bit more explicit than at other times, especially if someone is not recognizing. It's like Bob Dylan says in one of his famous songs, Forever Young. He says, may you always do for others and let others do for you. You want to make sure that that symmetry takes place. So what does this have to do with groups? If I'm sitting across a table from a group of people, then I have to be a little bit more explicit, or maybe a little bit more careful, a little bit more persuasive in making sure that that group of people understands the benefit that they have as a group from what I've offered to them or what I've provided to them. And a little bit of appreciation of how they individually have benefited from that. In other words, I want to make sure that they are appreciative of the concession or the value that I have provided them through the process of give and take. If I miss that, then I don't think I can really expect them as a group, as a corporate entity, to behave in the same way. The impetus, the sort of incentive to reciprocate is groups do it, obviously, for better or for worse, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, or we as a group need to pay back a group that has done something for us. But it has to be made a little bit more explicit. Does that make any sense? Come back on the line and tell me if that helps answer your question.
Yes, that does. As you pointed out, there's a fine balance between the it's no trouble at all and lording it over people. So you just need to move up that scale a little bit in the context of a group.
Yeah, that's a nice, succinct way of putting it. Cialdini tells a story of how in 1988 or 89, I can't remember which year, was the big Mexico City earthquake. At that very time, Ethiopia was going through a very difficult time financially. And actually, Ethiopia sent money to Mexico to help with the earthquake, even though they were strapped for resources themselves. And the reason was that back in the 30s, when Italy was coming into Ethiopia, Mexico had been very helpful for them at that time. And all of these years later, more than 50 years later, Ethiopia recognized the debt of gratitude they owed to Mexico. So 85, gotcha. So it's an example of where a group of people, the Ethiopians and their Ethiopian government, felt a sense of obligation to the people in Mexico. So it happens. And it really creates value because people will move resources back and forth in ways where they are properly utilized. Isn't that what banking is? You know, somebody would rather have money now rather than money later. It's the same sort of notion of reciprocation. Any other questions or comments before I'm in no hurry to move on. And if you look at my biography, I've spent lots of time living in Japan, so I have an unbelievable tolerance for silence. Sherry is adding something to the chat room. In the meantime, any other questions or comments? Okay. That's a great question, Sherry. Um, the thing about one of the best questions I've ever gotten, and I've gotten it a couple of times in different versions, at the end of a course is, hey, Mark, I've got a question for you. And it's sort of a version of what Sherry's asking. You know, I've been in your class. I got the message. I'm converted. I love to negotiate. I read the book. What do I do with people who haven't read the book, who don't understand this process? And that is just a process of quiet cajoling. It is the art of persuasion by reframing and presenting opportunities and options and alternatives to the person sitting across to you, the table from you, in non-threatening ways. You know, if you look at somebody and say, listen, have I got a deal for you? Those are my Bernie Sanders hands. And I got the Bernie Sanders haircut too. You know, I've got a deal for you. You may very well have a deal for them, and it may be the greatest deal that they'll ever hear, and it could be creative, and it could be mutually rewarding. And have I got a deal for you sounds like some sort of, oh my God, I'm going to get skinned alive. You know, looking at someone and saying, let's engage in the process of give and take. I know that this can be good for both of us. Well, what do they hear? They hear, let's engage in the process of I take and you give, right? There's a lot of suspicion and trepidation around this. So I think relationship building over time, working with people that shows a sense of integrity and respect for relationships, building out a reputation ahead of the time that you need to negotiate, I guess is what I'm talking about, is going to be real important. Let me go on for just a second. Let me go back to, I'm not a slide guy, but the slide we have up now right here on the board with the little red guy and the little blue guy pulling back and forth to find out where they're going to land in that zone of potential agreement is where a lot of people think this is the terrain for negotiations. But the really interesting thing about this is that one horizontal big black line indicates that there is one and only one issue on the table. As I said before, there are two people here, the red guy and the blue guy. They have their alternatives. They're arguing over one particular issue, whether it be time or, you know, how much pie you get or how much money it's going to cost or all of that. It's just one issue. As soon as you move out of that, opportunities open up quickly. I have a really good friend. As a matter of fact, I'm going to see him next week in California. He's a friend that I've known since I was a freshman at college at the University of California, Santa Cruz. So I've known this guy since 1971. So it's a long time, 45 years. And my friend dropped out of college, but he's one of the smartest guys I've ever met. He went and studied organic gardening in California, in Northern California, and he's quite a clever guy. As a matter of fact, I should tell you a story because it's apropos to what we're talking about today. I had one of the most interesting experiences with Jonathan. His name is Jonathan Fry, F-R-E-Y, and if you're near a Whole Foods, you can go down and buy some of his organic wine at the Whole Foods store. He does biodynamic and organic wines, one of the first organic wineries in the country. And I had a really interesting experience with Jonathan that sort of, in a way, laid the groundwork for my thinking about negotiations. And it was, I went to visit him up in Covelo, California, at a place called Round Valley. And he was studying up there with this guru of organic gardening named Alan Chadwick, one of the great fathers of contemporary organic gardening and French intensive farming, a British guy. Would stay and sit out in the middle of the garden and recite Shakespeare, and was really a rather interesting guy. Went up to see Jonathan, and when I went down to the farm, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. The fruits, the vegetables, it was just like a Garden of Eden. It was just amazing. And I went down and I pulled carrots out of the ground and sort of got the dirt off and took a bite, It was the most incredible carrot I've ever tasted in my life. It was like, it possessed the essence of carrotness, right? Strawberries you could smell from across the field. Everything was absolutely gorgeous. And I said to my friend, how do you get all these fruits and vegetables to be so beautiful, to be so delicious? How do you get all of this bounty from the land? And he said to me, he tends to talk kind of like a farmer, although he's, that sort of central casting simplicity of speech. He said, well, it's not the fruits and vegetables we think about. It's not really the starting point. What we do is every few months or every once in a while we come out and we check to see what the soil is like. We see what the moisture is like. You taste it, you smell it, you see how loamy it is, you see how sandy it is. You see, run a couple of tests to see how much nitrogen is in there. And then once you've sort of gotten a sense of where the soil is, then you go back and you sit around and you talk to your friends and you say, well, what is it that we can do to make this soil a little richer or a little bit more acidic or a little bit more basic? How can we enrich or change the soil? How can we make the soil better? He said, and once you do that, at the end of a given period of time, the fruits and vegetables are plentiful and delicious. He says, we just sort of work on the soil. And I was like, maybe I was 21 or 22. I was just like completely flabbergasted by the notion that, instead of thinking about fruits and vegetables, you think about the soil and the fruits and vegetables come. Well, if life were quite that simple, it would be great. But I sort of said, well, that's an interesting operating principle. Maybe I should think about that a little bit more. That's a story of my friend. The story that reminded me of him is I one time asked him, he was on my back porch out in Afton, here in Virginia, out toward the mountains where I live, and he was doing some deal with some people back in California having to do with land, and he was negotiating back and forth, and I was hearing the numbers, and they were very, very big numbers, land in California, right? And when he was through and hung up the phone, I said to him, Jonathan, you do these really big deals with your farm's money all the time. I'm just a simple little, teacher of negotiations, but you're out there actually doing these big deals. What do you think the key to successful negotiation is? And he just hesitated and thought for a second and then looked at me and he says, well, when the going gets tough, just make it more complicated. And I was mind blown because that is probably the most perfect academic answer you could have given, that anyone could give. And the reason it's such a great academic answer is because a lot of people say, well, the thing I really hate about negotiations, all those things we talked about before, but one of the things I really hate is they get so complicated. It can be really, all of these things going back and forth that you have to keep your eyes. My friend was saying, no, it's the complexity of the negotiation that really provides opportunity and can knock down roadblocks if you're stuck somewhere. It can pull you out of a sort of downward spiral and bring you back to a place where you can really make some forward progress. And let me show you this. I'm sure many of you have seen some graphs that look like this in the negotiation class where we show the results. If you go from looking at negotiation as just being, that sort of one line horizontally, we can look at it a bit differently. We can look at two parties, again, just two parties. And if you take a look at that y-axis, the perpendicular line, we can think of that as a return or benefit to party Y, let's say, right? And if you go up, can I write on this? You go up this way, benefit to party Y increases, right? Get rid of that. Likewise, if you go out, party X can accrue benefit as we move out to the right on the x-axis. So instead of graphing the return to the two parties as being on one line, we can chart it on an XY graph, right? We've all seen this, right? And because there are more than one sort of issue at play. As my friend Jonathan says, you've added layers of complexity. You can end up with a result that's here, you can end up with a result that's here, you can end up with a result that's here. These are all of these points of final conclusion that can be reached with a basket full of issues. And of course, there's a limit to how much value can be created because you reach that, what do you call it in economics, the utility curve, the Pareto frontier out there. Once you're on the Pareto frontier, clearly the benefit that's accrued to X is at the cost of Y, and the benefit that's accrued to Y is at the cost of X. So once you're on this line, you are indeed back to a zero sum. But if you were below that, if you were at a spot down here, there's lots of opportunities for you to do well together. This is what I love about negotiations, because moving from these points down here where both parties are leaving so much on the table, you have the opportunity to move up. And you have the opportunity to create other additional Pareto frontiers. Let's stay here just for a second. The question is, what keeps us down here in the hole? What puts us at these places where we failed to really appreciate the value that's at our disposal for creation? Any thoughts there? I want to throw it back to the group for just a second. What keeps us at these suboptimal points when we have all these opportunities? Douglas, do you have a mic? I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. That's a really interesting remark. And I agree, by the way. Can you elucidate?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, really well.
Yeah, sometimes people are afraid that they'll lose what they have. So if there's an early way to come to an agreement, you're afraid of losing what you already have. There's other things to fear, but I think that's probably one fear.
That's a super insightful thing to say. Now, if I'm a person who's fearful, how can you help me think about mitigating my fear?
What do you think?
How would you mitigate it?
How would I mitigate that?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's why I'm taking the webinar.
Well, let's think it through, and we can have other folks kind of jump in too. If you're fearful of losing what you have, so you're not ready to discuss other potentials, what can we do?
Develop more courage.
Okay.
Or maybe look for ways to do it where you're not going to lose what you have in the way that you're bringing up alternatives. But that's hard to know when you're doing it.
Right. And I think that if you say, okay, we're down here, or let's imagine here it's not so terrible. If we say, okay, we're here at point A, let's say, let me be clear. So if we went ahead and executed on this arrangement right now, we would have this, and this, and those conditions. And let's write that down and have that clear. Then if somebody comes back to you and has a counter proposal later, you can say, listen, my fallback, my best alternative to a negotiated agreement, my minimum value is here. And you've locked that in as a sort of worst case scenario, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And you keep moving those slowly out as far as you can, but making sure that the bird that you have in your hand is sort of somewhat secured. Does that make sense?
It does, but then sometimes you can get accused of retrading, and then the other party feels that they don't have to honor the bargain. That's the fear, I think.
Right. Well, now, my assumption would be that if I was on the x-axis with point A here, and I gave a proposal that would make a party, no, if I was party Y, and I made a proposal that would compromise party X, that party X would say, no, I can't do that, reciprocally, just as I said no to them if it was to my disadvantage. Does that make? Am I being too wordy here?
No.
So the notion is, let us engage in a process that opens up the door to us incrementally doing better together.
Yet when you're setting the table that way,
Mm-hmm.
then it's easier to discuss. But you have to be super careful, because especially if you're dealing with cultural differences, some people look at an agreement as a place to start the negotiation, and some people look at the finished negotiation as that's it. So I guess the table setting would either create a hostile environment, whether you know it or not. That's my take, or create an environment where people see some benefit for the potential for both. So if they're used to this, that there could be just a betterment for everyone, and you're setting it up properly, I think that's very possible.
You used an expression that I really like, which you said, you have to be careful in setting the table, right?
Yes.
I think that's a great line. What that means is the initiation of the process is incredibly important. The beginning moments. They may even precede you meeting that person, and those are reputational things. But let's not go all the way into that zone. Setting the table and framing. Why are we here? We are here to look out for the interests of ourselves and our constituents as agents. But we're also here to see whether or not we can do better together. And that is going to probably require an iterative process of adding layers of complexity, carefully considering what people's payoffs are for different structures, and making sure that we're comfortable moving forward together rather than forward at the expense of someone else who's going to move backward. And we need to be in an iterative process that continually re-examines, because it's clear from this second line out here, once you get on the Pareto frontier, you have an opportunity to move out. Carrie Snyder, you have a hand up.
Hi, can you hear me?
A little bit more.
I think you had asked can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So I think some of the things that prevent people from getting to some of these more optimal outcomes are simply time pressures, because this is a process that takes time and takes investment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is and not just time, but the art of listening, right? I mean,
yes.
Lots of times I teach the management communication course, and people come and say, gee, my objective here is to become a better communicator, and that means I need to be a more effective writer and a more effective speaker. Well, that's all true, but being an effective listener is probably one of the most difficult things, and this requires a lot of that. Any other ideas as to how people get stuck down in this zone? There are lots of different ways. Let me offer something to you, since we're bucking up against a little bit of time here. One of the ways, there are many ways that people get stuck down here. It's a refusal, a fear, as Douglas says, not just a fear of moving backwards, but a fear of revealing oneself, because if there's an asymmetrical exchange of information and I talk before you do, I stand the chance of being taken to the cleaners. And that's true, right? Being very circumspect about sharing information is important, right? I'll share a little bit of information about what it is that I want, what some of my priorities are, what my motivators are, but I want to make sure that I give you an opportunity to share some of your thinking as well, not just out of politeness, but out of being tactical. So if people do not share information openly, they will be stuck down in these zones. But there are two ways to get stuck down here in the southeast corner that are pretty generic and happen a lot. One is when you have party Y and party X, and together, both of them are pathologically competitive. They will not reveal. They want to make sure that they get all the value that's on the table. They don't want to share any information. They want to fight over every little last thing. If you have a list of items, they want to make sure that they do the very best on each one of them rather than trading off on priorities. Pathologically competitive pairs end up down here. Interestingly, the other sort of dynamic that puts you into this southeast corner is when these pairs are pathologically cooperative. People are willing to say, listen, let's not fight over this. You know, I'll take half of this, you take half of that. Oh, I don't want to ask for everything I want. I'll just ask for part of it. I don't want to, push the limits. I'm cooperative. And the counterpart says, you're right. Why should we get into this, back and forth? Let's just cut everything down the middle, right? You know the old story. I've told it a million times about the orange, the two chefs who are trying to figure out what to do. They each need an orange for their recipe, right? What shall we do? We each need an orange, and they're in a place where it's late at night, only one orange is available. What are they going to do? Well, the cooperatives the competitives will fight over it, and they'll kill each other, and no one will have an orange, right? If they're pathologically competitive in that way. But the other way is that they just divide it in half. And the story goes that they do divide it in half, and that one of them takes the orange and squeezes the juice out and puts the juice into the recipe. The other one takes her half of an orange and squeezes the juice out, and as you know, the story goes, they take the juice and throw it away. So one gets half of the juice and one gets half of the peel. The other stuff just gets trashed. Those are the pathologically competitive people down here. They don't do well either. So the thing is, one of the things I do like about negotiating that's sort of fun is it asks me if I'm sort of overly inclined to be cooperative. It's to make sure that I'm competitively cooperative, right? That I'm cooperative in a way that puts a little bit of, spice in the mix and says, well, I'm just going to force it a little bit, to be competitively cooperative. And it asks me if I'm feeling in a terribly competitive mood on a particular day, and I can demonstrate either one of these, to go ahead and be competitive, but to be cooperatively competitive. It's that sort of, that yin-yo, that yin-yang of life that is, I just love this symbol, not just because it's something that's used in Asia, a place I really like, but because it captures so much about life. It's those balances between those two things. It's like Einstein says, the genius is the one who can hold two contradictory ideas in her mind at the same time. And that's what we're looking at here. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about the dynamic of creating value and its juxtaposition of the dynamic of claiming value. And if any of you have been in class with me, you know that I always ask for people to remember this as an explanatory framework for most of the stuff we really need to think about in the area of negotiation. Rich, go ahead.
Yeah, so Mark, one of the things that we always deal with is, and probably a lot of the folks on this call are people that work in, or folks who work in negotiations with a purchasing department that gets involved. And we're just sitting around talking about how purchasing departments totally kill this theory, or it feels like they kill this theory because they just lock down the downside and the upside and keep us at a relatively low level on that Pareto. What do you think about that, and how do you address like a third-party group, like a purchasing group that really isn't, or doesn't, it's not perceived that they have an interest in expanding value creation?
Right. I get this a lot. I work with purchasing agents all the time on special programs they'll send to the group and we'll talk. Part of this is just it needs to be explored at the mid to upper management level. What is it that we're really trying to do? Listen, let me put it this way. Let's go back to this. One of the things that I don't know how many of you have taken courses with Venkat, who's now our Associate Dean of Faculty, one of the brightest guys I know, and maybe I'll sort of finish up with this that'll hopefully approach a little bit of this question, but generally a larger question of tactics versus strategy. Venkat says that oftentimes when people think strategically, they think about what their company or their corporation or their unit is trying to accomplish. They see themselves in a world of trade-offs, is how he puts it. That so oftentimes the manager is stuck in a world of trade-offs. And I think the purchasing departments are particularly inclined to be thinking in terms of that, because the driver is to reduce the price, reduce the delivery time, or increase it, whichever side you're on. Will reduce the delivery price if you're on purchasing. And you're stuck in these world of trade-offs, that means you're stuck in the Pareto frontier. Venkat says, certainly, the manager is much of the time stuck in the world of trade-offs, but it is the long-term responsibility of the manager to find out how to break out of those world of trade-offs and start to look at opportunities to layer complexity and to move into arrangements that provide higher Pareto frontier possibilities. Purchasing departments are particularly stuck in the way of thinking about the world of trade-offs. I think in the long term, it's a world we need to break out of. I think we could go on for another half hour. I don't think that's the way the webinar game is played here. What I would like to say is that my enthusiasm for this subject, I hope, is shown a little bit in the hour we've spent together. I think that one of the things I love about this process of negotiation is demonstrated here, that really it's a world where we really can create value and also think competitively about the notion of claiming value. But if we think about creating the soil, where my friend was saying, let's concentrate on the soil, the other thing I like about negotiations is a great starting point is to ask others what you can do for them and find opportunities for them to return to you. Did you want to make some closing quick remark before we go here?
No, just on behalf of the alumni, thank you, Mark. We appreciate your time and expertise and spending this time with the alums, and we hope that they will all join the next session with Professor Elena Litskina on impact investing on May 5th. Thank you guys for being on.
Thank you for your time. I hope we have the opportunity to engage again.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mark.